Thomas Reeves's journey into law enforcement wasn't born out of ambition, but from tragedy. As a young boy in rural Massachusetts, he witnessed a violent robbery that claimed the life of his father, a local shopkeeper. That moment seared an unshakable resolve into him, to ensure no family endured such loss without justice. During his college years, Thomas's knack for piecing together intricate puzzles led him to criminology. At the time, the notion of joining the police force seemed distant. He had initially planned a career in academia. However, an internship with the Boston Police Department exposed him to the grim realities of crime and the profound satisfaction of solving cases. In his rookie years, Thomas was quickly recognized for his ability to detect patterns others missed. An uncanny intuition paired with methodical investigation brought him his first major case, a serial burglar who had eluded capture for months. The success established his reputation, but it also painted a target on his back. Before marrying Victoria, Thomas had weathered the complexities of human nature, seeing both the worst and the best in people. Yet, he had never felt more vulnerable than when he first proposed to her. Victoria, then a rising star in Boston's cutthroat real estate market, represented the kind of success and determination Thomas admired. Their partnership seemed unshakable at the time. The couple's Beacon Hill home was a testament to their shared achievements. It was both a sanctuary and a symbol, reflecting Victoria's refined taste and Thomas's relentless dedication to creating a secure space for their future. Life seemed idyllic, though cracks began to form as their careers demanded more time and energy. As Victoria's real estate empire expanded, so too did the distance between them. What began as subtle changes, a new perfume, unexplained absences, grew into glaring signs of secrecy. For Thomas, whose instincts rarely betrayed him, it felt like the beginning of a case too close to home. The persistent drumming of autumn rain against the bedroom window mirrored the tension brewing inside Detective Thomas Reeves. Standing motionless near the entrance of their spacious closet, his hands buried deep in his pockets, he observed his wife preparing for yet another evening away. Victoria Torrey Reeves, exuding her usual composed charm, applied a vivid layer of crimson lipstick with practiced precision. Her calm exterior did little to ease Thomas's concerns. Years of policing had honed his ability to read people, and something about Torrey's recent behavior sent a chill down his spine. Subtle shifts in her demeanor hinted at secrets she wasn't sharing, and the mounting evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Ambition had always been one of Torrey's defining traits, the very quality that had drawn Thomas to her in the first place. But now, it felt as though that drive had taken a darker turn, and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that her priorities had shifted in ways she wasn't willing to share. "Another late-night meeting?" he asked, keeping his tone light, though his eyes stayed fixed on her. From the mirror, he saw the way she avoided his gaze, adjusting the pearl earrings he'd given her for their anniversary. "The Morrison deal won't wait," she replied with practiced nonchalance, reaching for her Chanel No. 5. "Don't wait up." Thomas watched as she smoothed the unfamiliar black Valentino dress over her hips. Her wardrobe had become noticeably more extravagant in recent months, her once elegant but understated style now replaced by high-end designer pieces. "Those meetings seemed to stretch later and later," he observed casually, leaning against the doorway as she gathered her things. "That's what happens when you're managing a $50 million project," Torrey said, her heels clicking across the hardwood floor of their meticulously renovated Victorian home in Beacon Hill. The house, much like her, was a symbol of her skyrocketing success in Boston's competitive real estate world. Trailing her downstairs, Thomas couldn't help but notice how often she glanced at her phone, her fingers moving across the screen with what seemed like nervous urgency. Her makeup was heavier than usual, and the entire picture, her polished appearance, the vague explanations, the nervous energy, didn't add up. "Is Jack Morrison joining tonight?" he asked, referring to the lead investor in her project. She paused, but only for a fraction of a second. "No, he's overseas. Just some board members and the technical team." Sliding her phone into her Hermes Birkin bag, she avoided his eyes again. "Sounds like a packed agenda," Thomas remarked, opening the door for her. The rain outside had intensified, battering the cobblestone streets. "Drive carefully. It's nasty out there." Out. For a brief moment, something flickered in her expression, something like guilt. She stepped closer, straightening his tie in a gesture that felt almost nostalgic. "Don't stay up too late working on that cold case," she said softly, before walking out into the storm. From the doorway, Thomas watched as her Mercedes pulled away, disappearing into the rainy night. Her perfume lingered, but so did another scent. Something woodsy and expensive, distinctly masculine. In his office, Thomas opened his laptop and activated the GPS tracker he'd placed on her car weeks earlier. The red dot moved across the map, heading not for the financial district but toward Back Bay. Picking up his phone, he dialed a familiar number. After a few rings, Detective Grace Rodriguez answered. "Grace, it's Tom. Can we meet tomorrow? Usual place?" She paused, but only briefly. "Everything okay?" "Just need a second opinion," Thomas said, his eyes glued to the screen. "Dorchester Diner, 7 sharp," Grace replied. "I'll grab our booth." "Appreciate it," he said. "I'll bring what I've got." After hanging up, Thomas leaned back in his chair, replaying the evening in his mind. He grabbed his notebook and began jotting down observations. The expensive wardrobe upgrades, the vague answers, the inconsistencies. Rain continued to pound against the window, and the clock in the hallway chimed 9, breaking the silence. Thomas closed the notebook and moved to the window, staring out at the rain-slick streets below. His gut told him that this wasn't just about an affair. It felt bigger, more calculated. He scrolled through his contacts, pausing at Grace's name. After years on the force, he knew the most dangerous cracks often formed closest to home. Tomorrow's coffee would be the start of something deeper. The Dorchester Diner hadn't changed in over a decade. Its cracked vinyl booths and faded menus had seen countless cops and detectives through tough mornings. And today was no different. Thomas slid into his usual seat across from Grace, the air thick with the comforting smell of coffee and bacon. Grace hadn't changed much either. Her sharp eyes scanned his face as she handed him a cup of black coffee. "You look terrible," she said bluntly, pushing a plate of hash browns toward him. "Nice to see you too," Thomas replied, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Thanks for meeting me. This isn't official." "I figured," Grace said, leaning back in the booth. "You've got that look, like there's something you're not ready to say out loud." Thomas pulled a manila folder from his bag, setting it between them on the table. "It's personal," he admitted. "But it feels bigger than that." Grace studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You sure you want to dig into this? Sometimes it's better not to know." Before he could answer, their waitress Betty arrived with their order. "Denver omelets, extra cheese and peppers," she said with a smile. "Coffee's on the way." Thomas nodded his thanks, but didn't touch the food. Instead, he opened the folder and pushed it toward Grace. "I need your perspective," he said quietly. "I think this is just the tip of something much larger." Grace scanned the contents, her expression hardening as she flipped through the pages. "You're right," she said finally. "This isn't just personal, it's a web, and I think it's time we start untangling it." Thomas nodded, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was something far more dangerous. And now it was time to uncover the truth. After Betty left, Thomas opened the folder, revealing bank statements, property records, and surveillance photos. Grace's eyebrows rose as she scanned the documents. "These transactions are deliberate," she said, pointing to a statement. "Just under reporting limits, spaced out to look random. That's textbook money laundering." Thomas pushed another paper forward. "Look who joined her charity board 3 months ago." Grace's eyes narrowed. "Alexander Wade? The hedge fund guy?" She quickly typed something into her phone. "We've heard whispers about him. Nothing solid, but enough to keep tabs." Thomas slid over a series of photos showing Tori and Wade meeting at upscale spots around the city. "It's not just money," he said. "Their body language looks staged, like they're performing." Grace nodded, her fork poised over her hash browns. "That's not an affair, it's tradecraft. If she's involved with Wade, this is serious." Thomas showed her video footage of Tori and Wade entering a hotel. "Watch how they scan their surroundings. It's deliberate." Grace exhaled sharply. "Tom, your wife might be in over her head. Coercion's a real possibility." "I've considered that," he said grimly, "but I need proof. That's why I called you." Grace tapped her notebook thoughtfully. "Wade's financials will be our starting point. My team's flagged suspicious real estate deals. We'll cross-reference with Tori's projects. But you have to keep this under the radar." "I know how to play it," Thomas said, his resolve hardening. "I just need the truth." Grace gave a small nod. "We'll get it. But be careful. This is professional-level danger. One misstep, and they'll know we're onto them." Thomas's expression was steely as he stared at the folder. "I've spent 2 decades keeping up appearances. I'll do whatever it takes." They spent an hour reviewing documents, Grace jotting notes and texting her team. As the diner emptied, their coffee cooled, and their unease grew. "Here's one more," Thomas said, sliding over a photograph. Taken yesterday at the St. Regis. Recognize him? Grace's face darkened as she studied the image. I do. He's tied to major players in international finance. If these people are involved, she didn't need to finish. They both knew the implications. Keep digging, Thomas said, gathering the files. But stay careful, secure channels only, and watch your back. As they left, Grace caught his arm. We'll figure this out, Tom. Just don't do anything reckless. Thomas managed a wry smile. Slow and steady, Grace. That's what worries me, she muttered, squeezing his arm before stepping into the rain. Thomas paid the bill, leaving a generous tip, and walked out into the dreary weather. His phone buzzed. Working late again tonight. Don't wait up. Tucking it away, his jaw tightened. The investigation was officially underway. Later that night, Thomas parked in the precinct garage. The rain had stopped, leaving the slick concrete reflecting harsh fluorescent light. Nearly midnight, the garage was almost deserted. His footsteps echoed as he approached his SUV, the weight of the day's findings heavy in his briefcase. Another set of footsteps made him pause, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. Detective Reeves? A young woman stepped into the light. Mid-20s, professionally dressed, but disheveled, she looked terrified. I'm Bethany Porter, she said, voice trembling. Wade's assistant, I need to talk. Thomas studied her. Late for a social call, Miss Porter. This isn't social. She pulled a USB drive from her bag, causing him to tense. Wade isn't who he claims to be. Neither is your wife. They're planning something terrible. I couldn't stay silent. Thomas didn't take the drive immediately. Why me? Why not the FBI? Her laugh was bitter. I tried. Wade has connections everywhere. Files vanish, complaints are buried, witnesses. She trailed off, glancing nervously around. Please, take it. Everything's on here. But be careful. They monitor everything. Thomas accepted the drive, watching her withdraw quickly. How did you get this? I'm his assistant. I handle his schedule, correspondence. He underestimates me, but I've been documenting everything. Her hands shook as she spoke. The charity board, the Morrison Project, it's not what you think. Offshore accounts, shell companies, people who vanish after one meeting. A car engine echoed, and Bethany flinched. No police reports, she whispered. No official channels. Just look at the drive, but not at home or the station. Thomas pocketed the drive. How can I reach you? You can't, she said, backing into the shadows. Be careful, detective, especially with those closest to you. Before he could respond, she vanished into the garage. The USB felt like a lead weight in his pocket as he scanned the now silent space. Reaching his car, Thomas texted Grace. Need secure location, off the books tech support. Her reply came swiftly. My place, 1 hour, bring coffee. Thomas took a long, indirect route home, maintaining a facade of routine in case anyone was watching. The USB drive in his pocket felt heavy, its implications replaying in his mind alongside Bethany's warning about trust. At home, he found Tori's note on the counter. Gone to bed early. Big presentation tomorrow. The house was quiet as he moved through it, instincts from years of training keeping his steps silent. After changing and grabbing his laptop bag, he left a note about following up on a case lead. In their bedroom, Tori appeared to be asleep, though the faint trace of that unfamiliar cologne lingered. Pausing at the doorway, Thomas replayed Bethany's words about betrayal. Back in his car, he used an old burner phone from his undercover days and took a cautious hour-long drive to Grace's house, ensuring he wasn't followed. The USB in his pocket felt like a live grenade ready to detonate. Grace was waiting in her office, her encrypted laptop ready. She took the drive, her expression serious. Are you sure about this? Once we know, there's no turning back. Thomas thought of Tori, Bethany, and the growing suspicions. Do it, he said. Grace inserted the drive, and files began to decrypt. Thomas sat silently, bracing himself. When the first file opened, the plans laid out were worse than anything he'd imagined. The next morning, Thomas sat in his car across from McKenna Security Solutions, a sleek downtown office building. The USB's contents were still weighing on him. Colonel James Iron Jim McKenna, his former Special Forces commander, was his next stop. McKenna's office reflected his disciplined nature, meticulously arranged awards, strategic furniture placement, and nothing out of place. You look like hell, McKenna said as Thomas entered, shaking his hand and motioning him to sit. When's the last time you slept? Not important. Thomas placed the USB on McKenna's desk. I need your expertise and your discretion. McKenna plugged the drive into a secure laptop, his expression darkening as he scanned the files. Your wife's caught up with dangerous people, he said, turning the screen to show a dossier. Wade's real name is Anton Petrov, ex-FSB, running a massive money laundering operation. Thomas felt a chill. Russian intelligence? Former FSB, McKenna clarified. He built his empire after the Soviet collapse. He displayed a web of financial transactions. The Morrison development isn't real estate, it's a front for laundering money. Why involve me? Thomas asked, leaning forward. McKenna pointed to a timeline. You started digging into property transfers tied to the development. Petrov saw you as a threat and decided to eliminate you. Thomas's stomach twisted. And Tori? McKenna pulled up more files. Her real estate success is built on dirty money. Petrov started with legitimate-looking investments and slowly pulled her into his operation. Now he has enough to implicate her in felonies, ensuring her cooperation. Thomas's thoughts raced. The homicide plot ties up loose ends. Exactly. Classic FSB tactics. Control, compromise, eliminate. Thomas stood and looked out the window at Boston Harbor. I need to get Tori out. Whatever she's done, she's still my wife. McKenna joined him. It's not that simple. Petrov's operation is entrenched. Walking away won't stop them. Thomas turned. Then we bring them down. McKenna grinned, a glint of their shared combat days in his eyes. That's the Tom Reeves I know. He pressed a button on his desk phone. Cancel my meetings. I need everything we have on the Morrison Development's security protocols. For hours, Thomas and McKenna combed through blueprints, security schedules, and financial records. McKenna's resources were staggering. Satellite images, building schematics, and personnel files for everyone tied to Petrov's operation. He's paranoid, but arrogant, McKenna said, spreading a map of Boston's financial district. He hides behind his Wade persona, thinking his FSB training makes him untouchable. Thomas nodded. We let him think his plan is working. Keep him comfortable while we build our case. Classic counterintelligence, McKenna agreed. I've got federal contacts who've been after Petrov for years but lacked the evidence. Until now. Thomas glanced at his phone. Another text from Tori. Working late again. The pieces clicked. This wasn't an affair. She was being manipulated by an exploiter. What's our first move? Thomas asked. We make him think he's winning, McKenna said, showing an organizational chart of Petrov's network. Feed him what he expects, gather evidence, and prepare to bring it all down. As they planned, Thomas thought of Tori, likely in a luxury hotel, unaware she was being played. McKenna's voice broke his thoughts. From now on, trust no one. Petrov has people everywhere. Thomas remembered Bethany's warning. Understood. McKenna retrieved burner phones and encrypted drives from a safe. Welcome to the Shadow War. Let's hunt. The next 2 weeks were a carefully orchestrated operation. With McKenna and Grace, Thomas planted disinformation while collecting evidence. Using Bethany's access to Wade's office, they fed subtle hints that the homicide plot was on track. Grace set up a secure operations center in an abandoned warehouse, its monitors tracking Petrov's network. 5 million just moved through the Caymans, she reported. He's consolidating assets. Thomas studied the data. He's preparing to act. The door opened and Madeline Walsh entered. A seasoned CIA operative, she exuded authority. Dropping a thick file on the table, she said, You were right. Petrov's network spans 12 cities. Thomas scanned the file. How does he operate? Madeline brought up a map dotted with compromised developers. He targets ambitious people, manipulates them with blackmail, seduction, or financial schemes, and turns them into pawns. Thomas's chest tightened. Tori's just another sufferer? Madeline's tone softened. She's vulnerable, but not innocent. She made choices, some unethical. Before Thomas could respond, a tech analyst interrupted. Wade just called an emergency board meeting for the Morrison development. They watched surveillance footage as attendees arrived. Tori appeared in a Chanel suit, her Hermes bag in hand. She's nervous, Madeline observed. See how she keeps adjusting her collar? Classic stress sign. Thomas stared at the screen, remembering how Tori fidgeted with jewelry when anxious. We've got audio, Grace said, filling the room with the board meeting's feed. Wade's smooth voice came through. All obstacles have been addressed. The final phase begins. Thomas's skin crawled. They were treating his planned homicide like a business deal. Your wife's unusually quiet, Madeline noted. She knows what's coming, Thomas said, his voice heavy. She's already made her choice. The board meeting lasted another hour, full of coded conversations and hidden agendas. Afterward, Tori and Wade left together, heading to their usual hotel. But something was different this time. Look at Wade's new security detail, McKenna noted, pointing to the screen. Ex-Spetsnaz, he's bringing in heavy hitters. They're preparing for action, Madeline said. The question is, what's our move? Thomas didn't hesitate. We keep up the ruse, make them believe their plan is on track, and gather all the evidence we need. Grace pulled up financial records. I'm building a RICO case. If we prove the pattern across all 12 cities, we can dismantle the entire network. We need solid proof, Madeline added. Something that ties Wade to Petrov and exposes the operation's full scale. Thomas turned to McKenna. Can we leverage the new security guys? One of them has a gambling issue, the other has family debts, McKenna replied with a grin. We're on it. Careful, Madeline warned. Push too hard and Petrov will sense a trap. Thomas shook his head. We don't push. We let them come to us. Madeline's tone turned somber. There's something else. Tori's involvement goes deeper than we thought. She's been actively participating for years. Thomas took a deep breath. Show me. Madeline displayed the evidence, and the truth hit Thomas like a gut punch. Tori hadn't been just a pawn. She'd knowingly made decisions that placed her firmly in Petrov's web. The woman he'd loved for 15 years was not who he thought she was. Later, in a dimly lit parking garage, Thomas waited in the shadows. McKenna's intel was clear. This was where Petrov's men would strike. A black SUV arrived, and 3 men stepped out, their movements revealing military training. Thomas recognized them as ex-Spetsnaz operatives from the surveillance photos. They swept the area, moving with precision, but they underestimated their target. Thomas had prepared meticulously, knowing every blind spot and acoustic trick in the garage. When the lights flickered, the men tensed, splitting up to search. The first went down silently, subdued with a chokehold. The second was more cautious, but fell to Thomas's experience and strategy. The third was the toughest, weapon drawn and scanning the shadows. Their brief fight left Thomas with a bruised rib, but his counterattack was swift and decisive. Securing the unconscious men, Thomas searched their phones. The communications he found revealed the extent of Petrov's operation, and something far worse, Tori's active involvement. One chilling message stood out. Target's routine confirmed. Wife says pension and insurance updated. She's ready to play grieving widow. Thomas leaned against a pillar, staring at the screen in disbelief. The designer clothes, late nights, and distant behavior weren't just about money laundering. They were part of a plan to have him liquidated and collect his benefits. Sirens in the distance snapped him back. He photographed the evidence and anonymously reported the scene before disappearing. By the time police arrived, Petrov's men would be unable to explain their presence without exposing the operation. As Thomas drove toward the safe house, his thoughts raced. The confrontation in the garage had provided vital evidence linking Petrov's network to organized crime, but it also exposed a painful truth about his wife. His phone buzzed with a message from Grace. Evidence secured, meeting at safe house in 30. He turned his car, his resolve hardening. The clock was ticking. Petrov's network would soon realize something had gone wrong. The safe house, a nondescript walk-up in Somerville, was perfect for avoiding detection. Parking several blocks away, Thomas approached on foot, carefully checking for any signs of a tail. Inside, Grace, McKenna, and Madeline were already working, their faces lit by glowing monitors. The phones? Grace asked. Thomas handed them over along with his own phone, loaded with photos of key messages. It's bad. Tori isn't just laundering money, she's been planning something far worse. Grace plugged in the phones, her face tightening as the messages appeared. This is methodical, she said. She's been setting this up for months, maybe years. Classic sociopath, McKenna muttered, reading over her shoulder. Playing a role to perfection. Madeline cross-referenced financial records. These life insurance adjustments fit the timeline. She's been methodically paving the way for your homicide. Thomas paced the room, his ribs aching. I thought she was a sufferer being manipulated, but she's been complicit all along. Madeline spoke softly. Sometimes those closest to us are the hardest to truly know. The room was silent until Grace announced. We've got everything to dismantle the operation. Financial records, contact lists, operational details. But if we act too soon, they'll scatter, McKenna warned. We need them to think their plan is on track. Thomas stopped pacing. They'll expect those men to check in soon. We've got 12 hours at most. A phone buzzed, freezing everyone. Grace read the message aloud. Is it done? Need confirmation for next phase. It was from Tori. Thomas felt like he'd been punched. His wife's detached words, treating his homicide as a task, shattered any lingering hope. We use this, Madeline said, her tone sharp. Keep them thinking everything's on schedule. McKenna nodded. We hit them fast while they still believe their plan is intact. Thomas stared at the message, memories of his marriage clashing with the cold reality. How long has she been planning this? How much of our life was real? Grace's voice was soft but steady. What's our move, Tom? Thomas straightened. We turn their plan against them, keep control of the narrative, and make them believe they're still winning. McKenna pulled up schematics of Petrov's operation. We know their personnel, protocols, and next moves. The advantage is ours. And they still think they're dealing with a cop, Madeline added. Not a special forces veteran with a team of intelligence operatives. Thomas looked at the message one last time. Send the reply. Let's set the trap. Grace crafted the response, and as she hit send, Thomas moved to the window, staring at the city lights. Somewhere, his wife awaited news of his end of life. Soon, she'd learn just how wrong she'd been. The surveillance room was alive with activity, its monitors glowing faintly as Grace adjusted the audio feeds. McKenna's voice came through their earpieces. Camera 3 is live. His team had worked all night planting surveillance equipment in Tori and Petrov's penthouse. Thomas watched the screens intently, every muscle tensed. The game had shifted. Now, it was their turn to strike. Thomas tensed as the elevator doors opened on the surveillance feed. Tori stepped out, followed by Petrov, now shedding his Wade persona. His transformation was striking. Gone was the polished hedge fund manager, replaced by the cold precision of a trained operative. Everything's proceeding as planned, Petrov said, his Russian accent now clear. Shrugging off his tailored jacket, he let it fall onto a leather chair. The police found exactly what we wanted them to. Grace's team had carefully staged the garage scene, planting selective evidence to support the narrative of Thomas's end of life, a cop caught in a botched robbery. Tori moved to the bar, pouring champagne with steady hands. The diamonds at her throat sparkled. Last year's anniversary gift. The detective on scene didn't question a thing, she said with satisfaction. Just another routine robbery gone wrong. Petrov raised his glass in mock celebration. The great Detective Reeves, brought down by common thugs. The irony is delicious. Thomas's eyes stayed on his wife, searching for any sign of regret. Instead, she smiled coldly. He never saw my potential. Treated me like a trophy wife. Now, everything he built is mine. She gazed out at the Boston skyline. The pension, the insurance, the house, it all transfers automatically. No divorce, no legal battles. Clean. Grace's hand squeezed Thomas's arm in silent support as McKenna's team moved into position around the building, waiting for the signal. You've exceeded my expectations, Victoria, Petrov said, joining her at the window. When I brought you into the Morrison deal, I wasn't sure you had the stomach for this, but you're a natural. Tori's brittle laugh filled the room. Real estate is a shark tank, Anton. You swim with exploiters or you get eaten. She set down her glass. Should we rehearse for tomorrow? The grieving widow must be flawless. Thomas's jaw clenched as he watched her rehearse her devastated spouse act under Petrov's coaching. Every detail was practiced. The trembling voice, the tearful gestures, the photo clutched at the funeral. Remember, Petrov instructed, this isn't just for the police. The whole city will be watching. The grieving widow of Boston's most decorated cop. Perfect for the headlines. I've been playing this role for 15 years, Tori replied, dabbing dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Each word was a blow to Thomas. The life he'd shared with her was nothing but a carefully crafted lie. Movement outside, Grace said, switching cameras. Petrov's security detail was arriving, SUVs pulling up to the building. They're rotating shifts. Thomas glanced at his watch. In 6 hours, news of his end of life would break. Petrov and Tori still believed their plan was flawless. Send the confirmation, he said. Grace sent the staged message from Petrov's men, reporting Thomas's elimination. Minutes later, they saw Petrov check his phone and smile. It's done, Petrov announced. By tomorrow, your story will dominate the news. Tori raised her glass. To new beginnings, she said with a smirk, and to my dear husband. He should have kept his nose out of the Morrison deal. Petrov nodded approvingly. Your delivery is better, but add a touch of grief when mentioning him. It will sell the story. For hours, they watched as Petrov and Tori discussed their plans, from press statements to financial moves. Each casual mention of Thomas's homicide revealed their ruthless intentions. Around midnight, Petrov left for his penthouse, leaving Tori alone. Thomas watched her reflection in the window as she practiced her widow's smile. The ambition on her face was chilling. No remorse, only satisfaction. "All units ready," McKenna's voice came through. "Waiting for the command." Thomas's gaze stayed on Tori. "Let them enjoy their celebration," he said. "Tomorrow we show them a performance they'll never forget." Grace gave a curt nod, already in sync with federal agencies preparing for the morning's critical operation. On a nearby monitor, Tori lifted her glass in a self-congratulatory toast to her reflection, unaware that surveillance cameras captured her every move. The scene was set for the grand finale, though only Thomas and his team knew how this story would truly end. The first rays of dawn bathed Boston's skyline in golden hues as Grace orchestrated tactical teams stationed across the city. Months of painstaking preparation had culminated in this moment, with simultaneous raids planned in a dozen cities to dismantle Petrov's entire operation. "Status update," Grace commanded, her voice steady over the comms as she tracked multiple feeds. Reports poured in with precision. "Team Alpha in position at the penthouse. Team Bravo covering the skybridge. Team Charlie securing the garage exits. Financial units ready to freeze accounts." McKenna's voice broke through the controlled chatter. "Primary target on the move. Petrov just left his suite, heading toward the skybridge." Through surveillance feeds, Thomas tracked Petrov's movements. The man's security details scanned for threats, unaware they were already surrounded. Evidence from the confiscated hitmen's phones had given Thomas's team everything they needed: security plans, guard schedules, even the codes to Petrov's private elevator. "Target has entered the primary location," McKenna reported, proceeding to Phase 2. On the screens, Petrov strode into Tori's penthouse. She was dressed impeccably for her role: a sleek black designer suit, makeup flawless, and red-rimmed eyes, painstakingly created with irritants rather than genuine tears. Standing before a mirror, she rehearsed her eulogy, her voice cracking at carefully calculated moments. "He was my everything," she recited, her hand over her heart. "A brave officer, a devoted husband. I still can't believe he's gone." "Impressive delivery," Petrov remarked, pouring himself coffee. "The press will eat it up. Do you have the charity statement ready? His memory deserves it, of course." Tori's smile was cold and exploitory. "Nothing opens wallets faster than a grieving widow starting a foundation for her late husband. We'll have millions moving through it in no time." Their casual plotting to profit from Thomas's supposed end of life sealed his resolve. He keyed his radio. "All teams, execute." The operation unfolded with clockwork precision. Across the country, federal agents swarmed offices, seized assets, and arrested key figures in Petrov's empire. Bank accounts were frozen, shell companies dismantled, and safe houses raided. Back in the penthouse, Tori adjusted her costume jewelry, chosen to project the perfect image of mourning, when the sharp crack of breaching charges shattered the quiet. McKenna's team surged through multiple entry points with flawless coordination. "Federal agents, down on the ground!" Petrov moved instinctively, his FSB training kicking in as he reached for a concealed weapon. But McKenna's operatives, former special forces, were ready. "I wouldn't," McKenna said coolly. "Your entire operation is collapsing as we speak. It's over." Tori's mask slipped, her meticulously composed facade giving way to raw fury as she recognized McKenna. "This means—" "Yes, Mrs. Reeves," Grace said, stepping in with her federal badge displayed. "Your husband sends his regards." Tori's stunned expression mirrored Petrov's as realization dawned. Her intricate web of deceit had been part of Thomas's larger plan all along. "Practicing your lines," Thomas' voice crackled through the team's comms. "Save them for your prison audience." Desperation seized Petrov. He hurled his coffee mug at an agent and lunged toward what he thought was a panic room. But McKenna's team had already neutralized its security features. "Clear. Target secured," came the final report. As Petrov and Tori were restrained, Grace recited their rights. Agents documented every piece of evidence meticulously. The phones from Petrov's hitmen had given them the leverage for RICO charges, ensuring no loose ends. "The Morrison Project?" Tori muttered bitterly as she passed Grace in handcuffs. "Seized like everything else," Grace replied. "Your elaborate scheme to stage a homicide gave us the predicate crimes we needed. Turns out plotting to eliminate a cop isn't the best cover." Similar scenes played out nationwide. Grace's phone buzzed with confirmations. "Chicago, secured. Miami, documents in custody. Seattle, operation complete. Dallas, no casualties." McKenna joined Thomas in the surveillance center. "Ready to face her?" Thomas straightened his tie, preparing to confront the woman who had orchestrated his end of life. "Everything's recorded," McKenna said. "The jury's going to love this." As Thomas ascended in the elevator to the penthouse, his thoughts churned over the long road leading here. Every step, every deception had been calculated to bring them to this moment. When the doors opened, Thomas stepped into a room of broken illusions. His marriage had ended, but justice had just begun. Months later, the federal courthouse buzzed with activity. The operation had made national headlines, and today marked the culmination of the trial. International crime ring, toppled corrupt real estate empire, exposed detective uncovers, wife's homicide plot. Justice at last was served. In the courtroom, Thomas stepped into the witness stand, ready to give his final testimony. The evidence presented throughout the trial had been indisputable. Surveillance videos, financial ledgers, intercepted messages, and the meticulously documented homicide plot. But the prosecution wanted to close with an emotional punch, allowing Thomas to share, in his own words, the depth of the betrayal. "Detective Reeves," the prosecutor began, "can you describe the moment you first realized your wife's involvement in this conspiracy?" Thomas let his gaze sweep across the courtroom, pausing briefly on Tori. She sat at the defense table, her polished image replaced by the stark reality of prison attire, her face bare and worn from months in custody. "It wasn't the homicide plot that broke me," Thomas said, his voice firm but reflective. "It was realizing that every moment of our 15 years together was a lie. Every anniversary, every holiday, every quiet evening at home, each one was just part of her act, a long rehearsal leading to my eventual removal." As he spoke, the courtroom screens displayed evidence, images of Tori and Petrov celebrating the supposed success of the homicide, videos of her practicing a grieving widow's speech, and documents revealing plans to use his end of life to funnel millions through fraudulent charities. "The most egregious crime here isn't just the money laundering or the conspiracy to homicide," Thomas continued, his tone sharpening. "It's the betrayal of trust, not just mine, but the trust of every honest citizen who relies on the integrity of our institutions. When criminals like Alexander Wade, better known as Anton Petrov, turn legitimate businesses into criminal fronts, they don't just steal money, they steal our faith in the system, in each other, and in the foundations of our society." The jury appeared riveted as Thomas explained how the investigation revealed Petrov's long-standing tactics. He would recruit morally ambiguous yet ambitious individuals, entangle them in increasingly illegal activities, and then let them take the fall once their usefulness ended. It was a pattern designed to protect him while expanding his empire. Later, Thomas sat with Grace in the courthouse cafeteria, both quietly watching news reports about the trial on a mounted television. The statistics were staggering. 13 fraudulent real estate schemes exposed, over $3 billion in assets recovered, dozens of conspirators facing prosecution. Grace slid a cup of coffee toward him, a small gesture that had become their unspoken tradition over the years. "Quite a way to wrap up a marriage," she said, her tone light but understanding. "Any second thoughts?" Thomas considered the question as he watched a segment about Bethany Porter, one of the whistleblowers who had been instrumental in cracking the case. Now under witness protection, she was rebuilding her life, her bravery earning her a new chance at a future free of Petrov's influence. "Just that I didn't figure it out sooner," Thomas replied after a pause. "But sometimes you have to walk through the dark to really see the light." The broadcast shifted to McKenna, whose security firm had gained significant recognition and federal contracts following its involvement in the operation. He was giving an interview about strategies to prevent similar schemes. Meanwhile, Grace, newly promoted to lead the organized crime division, had already begun implementing innovative methods to detect and dismantle financial crimes on a national scale. Outside the courthouse, Boston's spring sunshine cast a golden glow on the streets below, promising renewal. Thomas watched pedestrians pass by, unaware of how close their communities had come to being overtaken by Petrov's sprawling corruption. When the verdicts were announced, they were unambiguous. Tori and Petrov were sentenced to multiple life terms. The precision and detail that had fueled their criminal enterprise ultimately became their downfall. Every staged moment, every premeditated step had been meticulously documented and turned against them in court. As Thomas exited the courthouse, he felt an unfamiliar lightness. The case had been transformative, painful but enlightening. He had learned hard lessons about trust, deception, and the masks people wear, but also about the enduring strength of loyalty, integrity, and the justice system's capacity for good. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, he paused to look back. What had ended here wasn't just his marriage, but an era of his life defined by betrayal. Endings, though, often mark the start of something new, and perhaps something better. At the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, the sterile visitation room was a far cry from the luxurious penthouses Tori Reeves once called home. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on her face, highlighting the toll of incarceration. The sleek designer wardrobe and manicured image were long gone, replaced by the plain orange uniform of a federal inmate. 5 years in prison had stripped away her former glamour. Her hands, once adorned with sparkling rings, now rested bare on the scratched surface of the visitation table. Across from her sat Dr. Sarachun, a prison psychiatrist conducting research on psychological manipulation in white-collar crime. Tori's story had made her a prime subject. "Let's talk about where you are now," Dr. Sarachun began, pen hovering over her notepad. "Your appeal was denied last month. How are you coping with that?" Tori let out a bitter laugh, her voice echoing off the room's concrete walls. 25 to life, no parole, same as Petrov. She traced invisible patterns on the table. "He's in Florence, Supermax. Turns out the money laundering was just the tip of the iceberg. They tied him to arms dealing, human trafficking, the works." "And how do you view your role in his empire now?" "I was a fool," Tori admitted, her voice quieter than it once would have been. "I thought I was using him, leveraging his resources for my own gain. But the truth is, he was grooming me from the start. Every so-called investment in my business, every piece of advice, he knew exactly what he was doing." She leaned back in her chair, the weight of her mistakes evident. The ambition that once fueled her rise had become the very thing that dragged her down. In a high-security prison halfway across the country, Anton Petrov faced the bleak reality of his downfall. The empire he had meticulously built over decades had collapsed in a way he could never have imagined. What began as a federal investigation targeting 12 cities had unraveled operations spanning 27 cities and 3 continents. Authorities recovered not just $3 billion, but nearly $12 billion in illicit assets, exposing the vast scope of his criminal network. Meanwhile, in Boston's financial district, Grace Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, gazing out at the harbor that had been a silent witness to so many moments during the Petrov investigation. Her office, now part of the FBI's Real Estate and Financial Crimes Task Force, symbolized the progress made since those dark days. As the head of the newly formed unit, Grace had spearheaded a transformation in how financial crime was detected and dismantled. Lessons from the Petrov case became the foundation of a groundbreaking strategy, one that emphasized collaboration, technology, and foresight. "Director Rodriguez," her assistant's voice chimed over the intercom, "Colonel McKenna is here for your meeting." Grace stood as James Iron Jim McKenna walked in. His role in the Petrov case had catapulted his private security firm into the national spotlight, and now his expertise was indispensable to federal investigations. "Just back from Quantico," McKenna said, settling into a chair. "We're using the Petrov case as part of the curriculum. When I show the recruits how Thomas orchestrated the counter-operation, you can see the gears turning in their heads." Grace smiled, recalling the intensity of those days. "How's Thomas doing these days?" "He's thriving," McKenna replied, "running his own investigation firm in Colorado. He's got a knack for spotting financial fraud that most people can't even comprehend. His clients love him." After leaving the force, Thomas Reeves had established a private firm in Denver, specializing in uncovering corporate fraud and preventing insider threats. His book, Behind the Facade, Unmasking Corporate Fraud, had become a bestseller and a training staple for federal agents and private investigators alike. "And Bethany?" Grace asked, scrolling through her emails. "She just wrapped up her MBA at Stanford. Witness protection helped her rebuild her life, and now she's using her platform to advocate for whistleblowers. She's testifying before Congress next month." Bethany Porter's bravery had sparked a wave of change. Her testimony against Petrov's network had not only cracked the case, but also inspired others to come forward. Federal agencies had since implemented what they called the Porter Protocol, a set of best practices for protecting whistleblowers and leveraging their insights in high-stakes investigations. "What about the Morrison complex?" McKenna asked, accepting a coffee from Grace's assistant. "Completely repurposed," Grace said. "It's now a regional training center for law enforcement. They're using it to teach financial crime investigation techniques. Sometimes the best way to deal with darkness is to shine a spotlight right on it." Their conversation shifted to current cases, but Grace's mind lingered on the lasting impact of the Petrov case. Its revelations had forced a complete overhaul of Boston's real estate practices. New regulations, jokingly nicknamed the Reeves Reforms, required developers to disclose unprecedented levels of financial detail, ensuring no hidden players could operate in the shadows. In a modest diner in Dorchester, where Grace and Thomas had once shared countless early morning strategy sessions, a framed newspaper headline still hung prominently on the wall. "Boston detective cracks international crime syndicate," it declared in bold print. Betty, the ever-enthusiastic waitress, loved pointing it out to diners, proudly recounting how the two detectives used to brainstorm over coffee and omelets. The federal courthouse, now a frequent stop for law students, had become a case study in itself. The Petrov investigation was a cornerstone of criminal law classes, demonstrating the intersection of technology, law, and human psychology in modern prosecutions. Thomas rarely returned to Boston. Too many ghosts lingered in the city where his life had unraveled. Instead, he found peace in the Rockies, where his days were filled with meaningful work and the healing clarity of nature. Slowly, he had begun dating again, carefully rebuilding his personal life with the wisdom hard-won from his past mistakes. His last communication with Tori had come during her appeals process. She had written a letter, filled with apologies and pleas for understanding, but the words felt as hollow as their marriage had become. Thomas had chosen not to reply, letting silence convey the message better than words ever could. The funds recovered from Petrov's operation had been put to powerful use. A sufferer compensation program helped small businesses and families recover from financial devastation, while Thomas had dedicated his share of the forfeited assets to scholarships for children of fallen officers. It was his way of turning personal loss into something meaningful for others. Grace's phone buzzed, drawing her attention back to the present. Another case file awaited review. As she and McKenna pored over the details, she reflected on how the Petrov case had reshaped their lives and their field. "You know what Thomas always says," McKenna said, scanning the file. "The biggest scams don't hide in the shadows. They thrive in plain sight, cloaked in respectability." Grace smirked. "Speaking of scams, did you hear about the support group?" She was referring to a network formed by spouses and partners who had been blindsided by betrayal, much like Thomas had been. The group offered solace and strength, helping members heal while raising awareness about financial misuse and manipulation. Occasionally, Thomas would speak at their meetings, sharing his story to give others hope and a path forward. What began as a tangled web of lies and deception had left behind a legacy of truth and resilience. Though the shadows of Petrov's crimes still loomed, the light that followed was undeniable and lasting. From her office overlooking Boston Harbor, Grace pondered the far-reaching impact of the Petrov investigation. The criminal empire had been dismantled. Tori was paying the price for her choices, and countless lives had been irrevocably altered, some broken beyond repair, others rebuilt stronger than before. In her cell at the high-security Danbury prison, Tori clung to a single relic from her past, an old photograph tucked away in her belongings. It showed her and Thomas standing side by side at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for her first real estate project. They were smiling, full of hope for the future. On sleepless nights, she would stare at the picture, trying to pinpoint the moment her ambition became a poison, warping her values until success mattered more than people. Meanwhile, in a stark supermax cell in Florence, Anton Petrov's thoughts ran a different course. Reflection wasn't in his nature. Even stripped of his empire and freedom, he remained calculating, planning how to exploit any crack in the system. Though his reach had been severely curtailed, his scheming mind refused to rest. In Colorado, Thomas stood on the deck of his mountain home, watching the sunset cast hues of gold and violet across the peaks. His phone buzzed, a text from Grace alerting him to another case, another opportunity to stop someone else from suffering the betrayal he had endured. He smiled faintly, realizing how far he'd come. Endings, he had learned, were often beginnings in disguise, a chance to build something better, grounded in truth and resilience. The betrayal that once shattered his life had become the catalyst for a new mission, protecting others from falling prey to the same kind of deceit. Exposing the truth had been his first step toward rebuilding his life, and now it fueled his work every day. As night settled over the country, from Boston to Colorado, Connecticut to Florence, the central figures in this saga lived out the consequences of their choices. Some were confined by steel bars, others by the lingering echoes of their own guilt or resolve. all bore the weight of the truths the case had unearthed and the lessons it had taught. The story of Thomas and Tori Reeves, of Anton Petrov's empire and its collapse, became more than a criminal investigation. It stood as a testament to the power of truth over deception, of justice over greed, and the remarkable ability of people to rebuild after betrayal. In his Denver office, Thomas kept a small plaque on his desk, a gift from Grace. Its simple inscription read, "From darkness, light." Every morning, as he sifted through new cases of corporate fraud and financial manipulation, the words reminded him of what mattered most, that even the deepest wounds could lead to transformation. The plaque was both a symbol of his past and a beacon for his future, a reminder that the fight for integrity was worth it. And so, the story reached its quiet conclusion. The conspirators remained locked away, their schemes dismantled. The investigators continued their work, inspired by what they had achieved. And Thomas, no longer just a detective but a guardian of truth, found purpose in his mountain sanctuary. His work now was to help others navigate the same dark paths he once traveled, ensuring they, too, could find their way back to the light. It wasn't the ending anyone had expected, but it was perhaps the one they had earned. Choices had been made and consequences faced. In the end, that was all anyone could ask for. The chance to grow from their mistakes, to rise above their circumstances, and to move forward with the hard-won clarity that comes from confronting the shadows. No matter how dark the journey, the path to the light was always there for those willing to walk it.